Hey, welcome back everybody. So we're going to figure out this differential and bearings here this weekend. That's the goal. I've got a lot of nice comments, helpful suggestions, etc. about what I should do. I appreciate that from everybody. So what we're going to try first is, well, what I've already checked, I guess, before I turn the camera on here, is to make sure that the bearings are fully seated into the transmission case and that the caps were properly seated onto the bearing caps as well, or the bearing housings as well. I checked that. So what I did was, loosen up the 4 nuts. I took a big dead blow hammer, gave them all a good tap down to make sure everything was seated nicely, tightened up the nuts again, and tried to rotate it. And when they're tight, it basically locks up. I can't turn it by hand. So that wasn't the case. So what we think we got going on here is that there's probably a very minor either misalignment in, say, the case line boring. So when everything is clamped down, something is just slightly askew, and or there's just a tiny bit of misalignment in, say, the way the bearings were machined, just enough so it's something is binding ever so slightly when the caps are fully tightened down. Because like I said in the last video, when the caps are on there and finger tight and even just snug down just a little bit tight, I can still rotate the differential by hand, even if there's a little bit of a drag to it. When it only starts binding when things are fully clamped down tight. So I mean, we're really close. So talking with Matt and a few other people, basically what they suggest to do is to clamp it all down tight, which I did, force it over, which I did. I had to use a bar to gently, rotate it around because I couldn't pry it by hand. It was just tight enough. I couldn't rotate it by hand. And then we're going to take it all back apart now. We're going to look at the bearings, and there should be a couple of spots where we'll be able to see that where it was dragging. And we're going to very lightly scrape those high spots. We're going to put it back together, and we're going to check it again. And we're going to keep doing that until those high spots are removed and things rotate nicely when fully tightened down. Scraping in the bearings basically is what we're doing, which I should have known was the process we needed to do. It's the same process you do with a Babbitt engine, connecting rods and whatever, main caps for a fresh engine. You scrape them in to get that final fit just right. And I know of that process. I've just never done that process because I haven't had a need to until now. So I'm going to rig up the cherry picker and I'll pull this out, and we're going to take a look at the bearings and see what we got now, because I've since rotated it around when tight. So we'll be able to hopefully see where the tight spots are. Okay, I got the caps taken back off. One thing I want to address, maybe I didn't do a good enough job of explaining in past videos or showing, but I had a couple of people suggest that I just needed to adjust the shims in these bearings to, make it the proper tightness, like you would on a connecting rod or a main cap for an engine. That was a good suggestion, but in this case, that does not apply. These are not two halves of bearings. It is one solid bearing all the way around, so there is no shims, there is no adjustments. I'll show you that again once I get the differential out. And then some people are suggesting, I got to put a shim between my cap and my transmission housing. Well, they do not touch. This is not even a machine surface. That's just rough casting. The bearing caps do not contact the transmission housing. They merely clamp down onto the heavy shell of the bearing. So they're putting shims between the cap and the housing is not, that's not an option here. If this was a normal, like I said, a connecting rod or a main cap and a bearing, that would absolutely be what we would have to do to get that crush the proper amount. But in this case, that isn't going to work. Good suggestion, though. Okay, I got it off, cleaned up. Looks like, I don't know how much you're going to be able to see on camera, but it looks like this inside edge here was where it was rubbing a little bit. So I'm going to kind of round up some type of a heavy knife or something to do a little bit of scraping, because I don't have any actual proper bearing scrapers, Babbitt scrapers. A couple more things to address. People were suggesting maybe I could rotate the bearings 180 degrees. Yes and no. That would be a solution. They could only be this way as opposed to this way, because there's only one hole that the bearing cap, let's stay there, stay. There's only one hole that the bearing cap fits into, so it can only go that way. It could be this way or this way in theory, but they were kind of, they're better machined on the one side, the inside, than they are the outside. And that's the way they came out of there, so that's the way I'm putting them back together as well. So as far as the rotating them thing, that's really, again, not really going to help anything, not really an option. Another suggestion we had was to potentially take apart the differential and clock it in different orientations. And that possibly would help things too, because in theory, say this one might be a little bit tipped one way, we're rotating it. You got 3 different positions each half could be in. That potentially would fix something, an alignment issue as well, but for the sake of not playing around forever to try to come up with a combination, when chances are it's just a little bit of scraping in the Babbitt will solve the issue anyway. But that was a good suggestion, and that one did cross my mind as well. But there again, I'm pretty sure the way I have it punched, you know, I got 2, there's a pretty good chance I have this back together the same way it came apart. Not to say that that was right to begin with, because these have been machined as well too, but I have to assume that those are machined dang near as perfect as possible, because you had them on a faceplate on the lathe. So I don't really think that's probably going to fix it either. It's just a matter of fine-tuning the bearings. Like I said, we're so close. And in reality, I probably could just put it together as is, and once the tractor is running and driving, you know, once you drive it a few hundred feet, those bearings would probably wear themselves right in, and everything would be just fine. But for the sake of trying to get everything perfect from the beginning, I'm going to try to scrape them a little bit so I can rotate things by hand, and I know everything is good. Babbitt is pretty forgiving, I guess. So even if it is a little bit tight now, it probably would be just fine. But I want to try to make everything as good as possible right from the get-go here. So that's why we're going to do a little bit of scraping. Well, here we are a few hours later, and I don't know, probably 5-6 times I've had this in and out. Each time I scraped just a little bit more off of the bearings on the shiny spots, the dark spots where you can see it was rubbing. I'd scrape those spots just a tiny bit, put it back together, tighten the nuts down, rotate it a few times. If it was still sticky and hard to rotate, took it back apart, repeat the whole process. Like I said, I've probably done it 6 times here now. But I think we got it. I can rotate by hand without terrible effort. There's still one tiny little, right there, sticky spot, but with one hand I can go through that spot. So I'm happy with that. Like I said earlier, once the tractor is actually, oh come on, together and you run it a little bit, that'll wear itself in. I can confidently say that that's loose enough now, because like I said, I can rotate it by hand with one hand. Most of it's actually freewheeling loose. There's, like I said, there's one little sticky spot, but I'm happy with that. These are tight down, not actually torqued. They just tight as I could get them with the ratchet. We're gonna call that good. I'm going to put some cotter pins in here. I probably won't bend them over quite yet, because there's a chance I'll have to take this back out for something, I'm sure. You know how that goes. You think you got it all figured out, and then you end up having to take it back apart down the road. So I'm going to put cotter pins in everything, but I ain't going to bend them over quite yet. But yeah, I'm happy with all that. I think we can finally move on to the next thing. Awesome. Okay, so I got all the cotter pins in there, not bent over yet. Like I said, might have to end up taking things apart. Trying to figure out what to tackle next. Initially I was thinking to start working on that main shaft with all the gears on it, reverse. We could put all that back in there. And then I got to thinking, well, maybe I should focus on my pinion axles next, because I kind of got to get them in to make sure I'm happy with the backlash and all the spider gears and the differential. Get them all in there so I can check the play and everything. Get both pinion axles in there and kind of see how everything is fitting. In my mind is the way to kind of check and make sure all that's good. So I threw this side kind of halfway back together just to kind of refresh my memory how it went together. I think I got it right. There's at least one part. This washer here we're going to have to remake, because that is severely worn on the inside. And then looking at how this all goes back together, that plate that seals up your final drive goes on here. So we'll have to, I think that went here if I remember right. That's why we take videos of this stuff, to remember how this all goes back together. Or does that go behind there? I don't know, one way or another that goes in here. I think it goes here. So that means we're going to have to get our bearings and race situation figured out for our rear axle and get that plate back on there. Before we can put that plate back on there, well, we wouldn't have to right yet, but we might as well kind of do things in the right order. So we got to take a few step backs before we can take a few step forwards, I guess, as far as the pinion axles go. And it's all got to get done, so there really is no right or wrong order as far as I'm concerned. So that's probably what we'll focus on next week. It's finally actually a somewhat nice day out there. It's not raining, it's not snowing, and yes, as of 2 days ago we did have snow coming down here, as crazy as that sounds. It is currently the 22nd of May, and yeah, a couple of days ago we had snow falling from the sky. It was only like 36 degrees, pretty crazy. So we actually got a nice day. I better go out and do a little bit of yard work while the weather cooperates. We can come back on crappier days and work on this. But I just figured I'd give you a little update on what I kind of think we'll be tackling next, what we have to look forward to. So I'm going to wrap this up. I thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next week. Later.